There are moments in law where a single sentence in a courtroom can quietly reshape how millions of people interact with everyday reality. Not immediately, not loudly, but gradually, in traffic stops, in homes, in routine decisions that most people never connect back to constitutional law. And when a Supreme Court decision is described as 9-0, people often assume it means total clarity, total agreement, and total finality. But in practice, even unanimous rulings can raise new legal questions once they are applied to real-life situations. Now imagine this. You are sitting in your car, completely within the law as you understand it, but a recent ruling suddenly changes how that situation is interpreted by law enforcement or courts in your state. Not because you did anything wrong, but because the legal interpretation has shifted. So here's the question. Do you think Supreme Court rulings about firearms in vehicles create more legal protection for citizens, or do they create new confusion in how laws are applied on the ground? Share your answer in the comments. Now, to understand what is actually being discussed when people reference a 9-0 gun in your car ruling, we need to slow down and separate legal reality from simplified headlines. In my legal analysis, the Supreme Court does not issue rulings that function as universal instructions for every possible situation. Instead, it decides specific cases with specific facts. Those decisions then become precedent, meaning lower courts must apply the same constitutional reasoning when similar issues arise. The foundation of this entire issue begins with the Second Amendment, which protects the right to keep and bear arms. But that right, as the Supreme Court has repeatedly explained, is not absolute in every context. In District of Columbia v. Heller, the court confirmed an individual right to possess firearms for lawful purposes, especially self-defense in the home. That case was a turning point because it clarified that the Second Amendment protects individual rights, not just collective militia service. Later, in McDonald v. City of Chicago, the court extended that protection to state and local governments through the 14th Amendment. This meant states could no longer ignore the Second Amendment when forming their own gun laws. But the most important modern shift came with New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin. That decision changed the legal test entirely. Instead of balancing government interest against individual rights, courts must now determine whether a firearm regulation is consistent with the historical tradition of firearm regulation in the United States. In my legal analysis, this shift is critical because it removed flexibility and replaced it with a historical standard. Courts now look backward in time to determine whether a modern law is constitutionally valid. Now, when we apply this to the idea of carrying a gun in a car, things become more complex. Courts would likely examine whether restrictions on firearms in vehicles have any historical equivalent from the founding era or early American legal tradition. But this is where legal interpretation becomes difficult, because transportation in modern vehicles did not exist in the 18th century. So, judges are forced to compare modern situations to historical principles rather than identical historical laws. There is a strong constitutional argument that lawful possession of a firearm inside a vehicle should be treated similarly to other forms of lawful public carry, especially after Bruin clarified that public carry is part of the Second Amendment right. At the same time, another perspective raised in court is that states retain authority to regulate how firearms are transported in vehicles to ensure public safety and law enforcement clarity during roadside encounters. Courts would likely examine whether such regulations are narrowly tailored, historically grounded, and consistent with constitutional protections. Now, we also have to consider the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. During a traffic stop, courts evaluate whether any search or detention is justified based on specific facts, not assumptions. The presence of a firearm alone does not automatically justify extended detention, but it may be one factor among many that courts evaluate in determining reasonableness. In my legal analysis, this is where most real-world disputes arise, not from the existence of the firearm itself, but from how the situation is interpreted in context. The Fifth Amendment also plays a role, particularly in ensuring that individuals are not forced into self-incrimination during legal interactions. However, exercising rights must always be done within lawful boundaries and respectful cooperation with law enforcement procedures. Now let's talk about federal versus state law, because this is where the 9-0 ruling idea often gets misunderstood. Even if the Supreme Court issues a clear constitutional ruling, states still retain significant authority over how firearms are regulated within their borders, as long as they do not violate constitutional limits. This means that rules about transporting firearms in vehicles can still vary depending on the state. Some states have more permissive frameworks, while others maintain more structured regulations. That variation is not eliminated by a single Supreme Court decision. It is shaped over time through interpretation and enforcement. From a real-world perspective, this means lawful gun owners must pay attention not only to constitutional rulings, but also to how those rulings are being applied locally. Because what matters in practice is not just what the law says in theory, but how it is enforced in your specific location at a specific moment. And that is where legal risk often appears. In my legal analysis, the most common risk is not intentional violation, but misunderstanding evolving legal standards. A person may believe they are fully compliant based on older rules, not realizing that recent court interpretations have changed how those rules are applied. Courts would likely consider intent, but compliance is always measured against current law, not past assumptions. Now, looking at the broader political and legal reality, it is unlikely that firearm regulations involving vehicles will be completely standardized nationwide through a single ruling. Instead, the more realistic outcome is continued refinement through multiple cases over time. Supporters of broader gun rights argue that clearer national standards would reduce confusion and ensure consistent protection of constitutional rights across all states. Supporters of state regulatory authority argue that local governments need flexibility to address different conditions and ensure practical enforcement of safety laws. Both perspectives continue to shape how courts and legislatures approach this issue, and this brings us to the core idea. The law is not just a fixed rule, it is a system of interpretation, application, and evolution. So as we move deeper into this topic, the real question is not just what the Supreme Court decided, but how that decision is understood, applied, and enforced in real-life situations across different states. In the next part, we will break down what a 9-0 ruling actually means in practice, how it impacts everyday drivers with firearms in their vehicles, and what lawful gun owners need to understand moving forward to avoid confusion during real-world encounters. Stay with me, because this is where legal theory becomes something that can directly affect your daily life in ways most people never expect. When people hear 9-0 Supreme Court ruling, there is a natural assumption that everything becomes simple, settled, and uniform across the entire country. But in my legal analysis, that is not how constitutional law actually works in practice. A unanimous decision means the justices agreed on the outcome of a specific legal question under specific facts. It does not mean every related situation becomes automatically identical in interpretation. Lower courts still have to apply that reasoning to real-world scenarios that often look very different from the original case. Courts would likely examine future cases involving firearms in vehicles by asking one key question. Does this situation fit within the constitutional principles the Supreme Court just clarified, or does it raise a new variation that requires further interpretation? That is where most legal development happens, not at the headline level, but in the details that follow. Now, in practical terms, for lawful gun owners, the most important impact of any ruling related to firearms in cars is how it affects everyday movement and legal expectations during routine travel. In my legal analysis, the key issue is consistency. A person driving through one state may face a different set of regulatory expectations than in another. Even when constitutional protections exist, the administrative rules around storage, transportation, and interaction with law enforcement can vary. Courts would likely consider whether those variations still respect the core constitutional right recognized under the Second Amendment, while allowing states some level of regulatory structure. There is a strong constitutional argument that carrying or transporting a legally owned firearm in a private vehicle is part of lawful possession and should not be treated as inherently suspicious or criminal in nature. At the same time, another perspective raised in court is that states must retain the ability to regulate how firearms are carried in public spaces, including vehicles, to maintain clear enforcement standards. This balance is where much of the legal debate continues. Now let's connect this to real-world consequences. For many people, especially those who travel frequently across state lines, the biggest challenge is not the constitutional principle itself, it is the variation in how that principle is applied. A lawful action in one jurisdiction may require additional compliance steps in another. This does not necessarily mean rights are being removed, but it does mean that legal responsibility becomes more context-dependent. In my legal analysis, this is where awareness becomes essential, because courts consistently evaluate cases based on current law, not personal understanding or past experience. Now, from a Fourth Amendment perspective, interactions involving traffic stops and firearms continue to be evaluated based on reasonableness. Courts would likely examine whether law enforcement actions during a stop are based on specific, observable facts rather than general assumptions. The Fifth Amendment also remains relevant in ensuring that individuals are not compelled into self-incrimination during legal encounters. But again, the exercise of those rights must always remain within lawful and respectful boundaries. Looking at the broader constitutional framework, Supreme Court precedent such as Heller, McDonald, and Bruin continues to guide how all of these issues are interpreted. But none of these cases operate in isolation. Each new decision builds on the reasoning of previous ones, while also responding to new legal questions as they arise. From a political and legal reality standpoint, it is unlikely that firearm regulation involving vehicles will become completely uniform across all states in the near future. Instead, what is more realistic is continued clarification through additional court cases, legislative adjustments, and evolving enforcement practices. Supporters of stronger constitutional protections argue that clarity and uniformity would reduce confusion and ensure equal treatment of rights regardless of geography. Supporters of state-level regulation argue that flexibility is necessary to account for different environments, population densities, and enforcement needs. Both perspectives continue to influence how the law develops. And this leads to the most important takeaway. A Supreme Court ruling, even a unanimous one, is not the end of legal conversation. It is the beginning of a new phase of interpretation. The real impact is shaped over time through how that ruling is understood and applied in real-world situations. So as we reach the end of this breakdown, the most important question is not just what the court decided, but how that decision changes the way everyday legal situations are viewed moving forward. Do you believe Supreme Court rulings like this actually make firearm laws clearer for ordinary citizens? Or do they create more complexity as states and courts interpret them differently over time? Share your thoughts in the comments. This is a conversation that directly connects law, rights, and everyday life. And if you want more clear, fact-based legal explanations that break down major court decisions in a way that actually makes sense in real life, make sure to subscribe for future updates. Because at the end of the day, the law is not just something written in court opinions. It is something you live with every time you turn the key, step into your car, and move through a system that is constantly evolving around you. And understanding that system, that is what turns confusion into clarity.